My dad's hand shot forward and ripped the name card off the front row chair. He crushed it in his fist, the cardstock cracking like a small bone snapping in a quiet room. Dozens of officers in dress uniforms turned their heads. "You don't deserve this family," he hissed through his teeth, his face twisted in absolute disgust. "You've been a parasite your whole life. Go sit in the back or get the hell out of here before you ruin my son's promotion." He said it loud enough for the first 3 rows to hear. A full bird colonel 2 seats over locked his jaw and stared at the floor. My stepmother Loretta smoothed her skirt and looked away. Her lips curled into a satisfied little smirk, as if the trash had finally been told to take itself out. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. My fingers went numb. I picked up my cover from the chair, tucked it under my arm, and turned for the doors. 20 years of combat deployments, and the only place I ever bled without a tourniquet was inside my own family. Until a general stood. He bypassed my brother. He bypassed the podium. He marched straight to me, his boots striking the floor in clean, deliberate cracks. He stopped. His right hand trembled as it snapped into a crisp salute. "I owe you my life, Sergeant. We all do. Before I tell you what happened, take a second to like and subscribe. But only if this story hits close to home. And let me know in the comments where are you watching from, and what time is it there right now." The scent hit me before anything else. Loretta's perfume. That thick, cloying sweetness I hadn't smelled in over 20 years, drifting off someone's collar in the crowd behind me. My vision tunneled. The auditorium dissolved. And I was 10 years old again, standing in a hospital corridor that reeked of bleach and stale coffee, watching a nurse pull a white sheet over my mother's face. My mom died on a Tuesday. I remember because my dad had a business dinner that night, and he kept checking his watch while the monitors flatlined. He signed the paperwork at the nurse's station, adjusted his tie in the reflection of a glass partition, and walked out without looking back. He didn't hold my hand. He didn't bend down and explain what was happening. I sat alone in the waiting room for 3 hours, my feet dangling off the plastic chair, watching the vending machine's fluorescent light flicker against the wall, until my uncle finally picked me up. She left me her stubborn jaw and her sad brown eyes. She left me a shoebox of photographs I would hide under my mattress for the next 8 years. And she left me completely alone with Walt Price, a man whose entire identity ran on the gasoline of public admiration. He measured every human being on 2 metrics: how much money they had and how good they made him look at dinner parties. A grieving 10-year-old daughter with scraped knees and tangled hair scored 0 on both counts. The replacement parts arrived 7 months later. My dad remarried a woman named Loretta, who walked through the front door carrying matching Louis Vuitton luggage, and a 13-year-old daughter named Sabrina. Sabrina had straight blonde hair, a pageant-trained smile, and a voice like warm honey poured over everything she said. My dad lit up the second he laid eyes on her, a shiny new ornament for his glass display case. He put his arm around her shoulder that first evening and introduced her to his golf buddy over the phone as my beautiful daughter. I was standing 6 feet away in the kitchen doorway, a peanut butter sandwich in my hand. He didn't look at me. He didn't introduce me. Loretta's first act as the new lady of the house was surgical and precise. She walked into the living room, lifted my mother's framed photograph off the wall, and placed it face down inside a cardboard box without a single word. She carried that box to the garage and set it behind the lawnmower next to a bag of fertilizer. She didn't ask my dad's permission. She didn't need to. By the end of that first week, Sabrina had claimed my bedroom, the one with the window overlooking the backyard, and the pink curtains my mom had sewn. My clothes were stuffed into garbage bags and hauled up to the attic by my own hands because nobody else was going to carry them. The attic was a coffin with a slanted ceiling and one small window caked with dust. Exposed beams lined the roof. In summer, the heat pressed down like a wet wool blanket, turning the air so thick I could taste it wood-rot old insulation and the sweet chemical stink of Loretta's perfume rising through the floorboards from the bedroom below. The boards screamed under every footstep. I could hear everything happening in the house beneath me. Sabrina laughing at something on television, the clink of wine glasses, my dad's booming voice performing for company. Up in the attic, I had silent spiders and a bare mattress on the floor. Every basic thing I needed was treated like charity I hadn't earned. A new pair of shoes for school triggered a 20-minute lecture from my dad about the cost of raising someone else's leftover kid. He delivered this speech standing in the kitchen doorway, Loretta nodding behind him, while Sabrina sat on the living room couch, trying on a brand new pair of white Nikes he had bought her that afternoon. A permission slip for a class field trip sat unsigned on the kitchen counter for 2 weeks until the trip passed. And when I asked about it, Loretta shrugged and said she forgot. Sabrina's permission slips were signed the same day they came home. Christmas was the worst. Loretta would stack presents under the tree 15-20 boxes, all for Sabrina and my dad. Ribbons, bows, matching wrapping paper. My gift, when it existed at all, was a single drugstore item wrapped in newspaper. One year, it was a pack of socks. Sabrina opened a jewelry box and squealed. I held the socks in my lap and kept my face still. I was 11. I had already learned that crying in front of these people was handing them ammunition. Whenever I committed the crime of being a normal child, spilling a glass of milk, leaving a light on, tracking mud on the kitchen floor, my dad would corner me. He was a big man, 6'2", and he knew how to use his size. He would stand with his back to the doorframe, so I couldn't leave his face 6 inches from mine. Adjusting his expensive silk tie with one hand while he pointed at me with the other, his finger jabbing the air like a weapon. "Don't embarrass me, Diana. You're polluting this house." I learned to read his rage by the lines on his forehead. 3 horizontal creases meant garden variety irritation, keep my head down and stay out of his walking path. The single deep vertical crease between his eyebrows meant a storm was coming, vanish immediately. Disappear into the attic. Close the door, sit on the mattress and count my own breathing until the floorboards stopped vibrating from his pacing below. I trained myself to become invisible. I ate after everyone else left the table. I washed my own dishes and put them away before anyone noticed I had eaten. I walked on the outer edges of the staircases where the wood didn't creak. I became a ghost, haunting my own childhood home. And nobody noticed my absence because nobody had been looking for me in the first place. The only part of myself I refused to let the house kill was the part connected to Logan. My half-brother was born 2 years after Loretta moved in. My dad barely looked at the infant babies, were boring, noisy, messy, and offered zero social currency at dinner parties until they were old enough to wear a blazer and shake hands. Loretta held the newborn at arm's length, grimacing at the spit-up on her blouse, and handed him off to me like passing a bag of dirty laundry. Then she went back to her wine. So I raised him. When the house slept and the lights went dark, I crept down from the attic and lifted Logan from his crib. I paced the hallway with him pressed against my chest, his tiny fist gripping the collar of my nightshirt, his red face scrunched and screaming at a world that hadn't bothered to welcome him properly. His crying was the only sound in that house that didn't make me flinch. I looked down at his wet, furious little face one night, 3 a.m. hours. My bare feet cold on the hardwood, the whole house asleep except for the 2 of us. And I made a silent pact. I accepted my role as the ghost of the Price family. I would stay invisible. I would absorb every insult. I would swallow every cruelty and keep my mouth shut, solely to act as the unseen shield for this kid. He was the only thing in that house worth protecting, and I would protect him until my body gave out or the house burned down around us. I enlisted the morning I turned 18, walked 3 miles to the bus depot in the pre-dawn dark, carrying a duffel bag packed with everything I owned, which wasn't much: 2 changes of clothes, a toothbrush, the shoebox of my mother's photographs, and $43 in wrinkled bills. Nobody drove me. Nobody stood on the front steps and waved. My dad didn't even know I had left until he noticed the attic door hanging open that evening. He told Loretta I had finally crawled off somewhere and went back to cutting his steak. The bus depot smelled like diesel fuel and wet concrete. A flickering overhead light buzzed against the pre-dawn silence. A drunk man slept across 3 plastic chairs near the vending machines, his coat pulled over his head. I sat on the bench and waited for the 5:15 Greyhound with my duffel between my boots, watching a janitor mop the floor in slow circular strokes. I pulled out the one item I had packed that wasn't clothing or hygiene, a photograph of my mother. I looked at her face, slid it back into the shoebox, and zipped the duffel closed. When the bus arrived, I climbed aboard, walked past 6 empty rows, and sat in the back. I pressed my forehead against the cold window and watched my hometown shrink. A cluster of lights, a glow on the horizon, then nothing. The only thing I felt was the absence of pain. For the first time in 8 years, nobody was going to corner me in a hallway and tell me I was pollution. Nobody was going to hand me a pack of socks on Christmas morning while their real daughter opened jewelry. Nobody was going to adjust an expensive tie 6 inches from my face and call me a pollutant in my own home. The Army broke me down and rebuilt me from the foundation up. Basic training at Fort Sam Houston stripped away the flinching, the cowering, the compulsive need to scan foreheads for rage lines. My drill sergeant, a stocky woman from South Carolina, with a voice like a diesel engine and zero tolerance for self-pity, spotted something in me on day 3. She watched me stabilize a fellow recruit who had collapsed from heat exhaustion, his pulse going thready, his skin the color of old chalk. My hands were steady. My breathing was metronomic. My focus locked on the pulse point in his neck while 18 other recruits stood in a frozen circle doing nothing useful. "Price!" she barked, standing over me while I held pressure on his cooling forehead. "You don't freeze. That's rare. You're going to save lives or I'm going to know the reason why." She was right. I became a combat medic, 68 Whiskey, the designation that meant I ran toward the gunfire while everyone else ran away from it. The battlefield clarified everything the attic had confused. My sharp observation skills, reading micro-expressions, anticipating volatile shifts in atmosphere weren't defects anymore. They were precision instruments. I used to read my dad's forehead to decide if I should hide. Now I read a wounded soldier's pupils to decide if he was going into hypovolemic shock. The difference was that reading those signs now meant saving a life, instead of saving myself from a beating. I climbed the ranks through 3 deployments, each one longer, hotter, and bloodier than the last. Sergeant after my first tour. Staff sergeant after pulling 2 Marines out of a burning Humvee with my bare hands while their own medic froze in the ditch. Sergeant first class after the mountain ridge, the one that would later put a medal around my neck and a bullet scar on my calf. I invested my combat deployment pay through a military financial advisor at the base who wore glasses thicker than bulletproof glass and spoke exclusively in percentages. I bought a rental property outside Fort Bragg, then a second one near Camp Lejeune. I fed index funds and watched the numbers climb. I built a fortress of financial independence, brick by quiet brick, dollar by deployed dollar. Every cent was a layer of armor between me and the life I had crawled out of at 18. My service record read like a manual on controlled violence. 2 Bronze Stars, a Purple Heart. Commendation letters from 3 different commanding officers who used words like extraordinary composure and selfless disregard for personal safety. On paper, I was everything a soldier could be. In reality, I was still a 10-year-old girl trying to earn a seat at a table that didn't want her. But I carried a fatal tactical flaw embedded so deep in my operating system that no drill sergeant, no deployment, no amount of battlefield clarity could extract it. I still wanted my dad to love me. When his delusional business ventures collapsed, and they collapsed regularly, because the man had the financial instincts of a gambling addict hypnotized by a slot machine, I quietly wired him cash from overseas. When the roof leaked, I paid the contractor by phone from a forward operating base in Kandahar. When the bank sent a repossession notice for his precious Mercedes-Benz, I covered 3 months of missed payments with a single wire transfer that took me 45 seconds and cost me $5,000. When Logan needed tuition for the officer academy, the same academy that would turn him into the captain, my dad would eventually brag about to strangers, I wrote the check without being asked, without being thanked, without anyone in that house knowing where the money came from. I believed with the irrational desperation of a 10-year-old girl still sitting in a hospital waiting room that if I established a flawless logistical supply line of money, my dad would finally look at me and see a daughter worth claiming. I was dead wrong. To a narcissist, my money wasn't generosity. It was tribute, an inherent right. He took my cash, poured it into country club memberships and top-shelf wine and tailored suits and restaurant dinners with people he wanted to impress. And then wearing a charcoal blazer my deployment checks had paid for. He leaned across the Thanksgiving table, a table covered in food I'd financed, and declared to a room full of nodding guests that I was a failure who can't do anything but leech off the family. His golf buddy Frank sat to his right, swirling a glass of Merlot I had bought. Frank chuckled and shook his head with the comfortable pity of a man who had never once questioned where the Price family money actually came from. "Shame about Diana," Frank said. "Every family's got one, I guess." Frank's wife Donna leaned over and patted Loretta's hand in solidarity. 2 women bonding over the inconvenience of a disappointing child who was at that exact moment paying the electric bill that kept their dinner warm. My dad raised his glass and clinked it against Frank's, a toast to my failure. The whole table laughed. 8 people sitting in a house my combat pay maintained, eating food, my wire transfers, purchased warmed by a furnace, my auto pay kept running, and every single one of them believed they were looking at a loser. I sat in the corner of the dining room, my hands in my lap under the tablecloth, pressing the tines of my fork into my palm until 4 white crescents appeared in the skin. I was funding the entire theatrical production. The wine, the food, the house, the suit, the Mercedes in the driveway, and the audience was laughing on cue. In 2016, the Army informed me I was receiving the Medal of Honor. The action had happened 5 years earlier on a mountain ridge in Afghanistan that doesn't carry a name on any civilian map. I didn't feel heroic about it. I felt the same thing I always felt after a firefight: exhaustion, gratitude that my hands had moved fast enough, and a dull ringing in my left ear that would never fully fade. But the ceremony was real. The President of the United States was going to pin that medal on my chest inside the White House. The Army was flying my designated guest to Washington on military transport, all expenses covered. And I stood in a base corridor at Fort Bragg, my back flat against a cold cinder block wall, and dialed my dad's number with hands that had been rock steady under mortar fire, but were now shaking like a recruit's on the first day of basic. The phone rang 4 times. He picked up with the impatient sigh he used for interruptions to his evening routine, the sigh that meant I was stealing seconds from his television. "Dad, the President is pinning a medal on me. The Army is covering everything. I want you and the family to come." Silence. A long, suffocating void that stretched across the phone line. I could hear the television in the background, muffled applause from a talk show audience. I pressed the phone harder against my ear, my knuckles white around the case, waiting for the words that a normal father would say. "Congratulations, I'm proud. We'll be there." His voice came through like a surgical blade, cold and mocking, each syllable a deliberate incision designed to open the wound wider. "Diana, you never drop the act, do you? What do you even do besides type and clean up logistics, clinging to someone else's fame? I don't have time for your pathetic stunts." Click. The hollow dial tone punched into my ear. I stood in that corridor for a full minute with the phone still pressed against my face, staring at the cinder block wall 2 inches from my nose. The tiny hairline cracks in the institutional beige paint spread out like a road map of every lie I had ever told myself about earning his approval. He didn't come to Washington. Loretta didn't come. Sabrina didn't come. Logan was deployed overseas and couldn't make it. He was the only one with a legitimate excuse. The day of the ceremony, I put on my dress blues and walked into the East Room of the White House with an empty guest list. The room was full of generals with enough stars on their shoulders to fill a constellation chart, senators who shook my hand with both of theirs, and Gold Star families who had buried their sons and daughters for the same flag I served. A mother in the front row wore her dead son's dog tags around her neck and still managed to smile at me. The President of the United States placed the Medal of Honor around my neck. His hands were warm and steady. He leaned in and said something private that I will carry with me for the rest of my life. The entire room, 200 people who had earned or sacrificed more than most civilians could comprehend, stood and applauded. Cameras flashed. A string quartet played somewhere behind the curtain. And in the second row, 3 chairs sat empty, reserved, name cards in place. My dad, my stepmom, my stepsister. Not one of them had bothered to show up. The knife twisted deeper 3 weeks later. Sabrina, my stepsister, the ornament, the blonde highlight in my dad's display case, had been busy. She typed out a group text to every member of our extended family, aunts, uncles, cousins, second cousins, everyone in the contact list. She attached a screenshot of my White House photographs and added a laughing emoji. "Diana's little Photoshop project," she wrote. She found one of those websites that lets you paste yourself into pictures with famous people. Kind of sad, honestly. My Aunt Helen, the one who sent Christmas cards with glitter that got everywhere, forwarded the text to 3 other relatives with LOL and a shaking head emoji. The lie spread like spilled oil, seeping into every corner of the family network. At Thanksgiving, another dinner funded by my combat pay, my dad sat at the head of the table in a charcoal suit I'd paid for. He leaned toward my Uncle Ray, adjusting his cufflinks with the practiced ease of a man performing his favorite monologue. "Diana," he said, his voice loud enough for the entire table. "She's just a clerk, runs petty errands on base, sorts paperwork, 0 actual merit." Uncle Ray nodded, sipped his wine, and reached for the rolls. I excused myself. drove my truck to the base bar, a cinder block building with a hand-painted sign and a parking lot full of dented pickups. I sat on a cracked vinyl stool and ordered a bourbon I had no intention of drinking. The room smelled like peanut shells, floor wax, and decades of spilled beer. A jukebox in the corner played something old and country. I ran my thumb along the wet condensation ring my glass left on the bar top, tracing circles in the moisture. A fist slammed the bar hard enough to rattle every glass within 3 feet. Joe Pratt, my battle buddy. 6'2", 230 pounds of muscle wrapped around a skeleton forged from pure stubbornness and bad coffee. He had bled beside me on 3 deployments, carried me on his back once when my legs gave out on a 15-mile ruck march, and possessed the diplomatic capacity of a cinder block. Joe had met my dad exactly once at a base family event 3 years prior. Afterward, he stood in the parking lot, spat on the asphalt, and said 4 words, "Your old man's poison." I told him to mind his own business. He spat again and walked away. He had been right, and I had spent 3 more years proving it. Joe pulled up the stool next to mine, ordered nothing, planted his elbows on the bar, and stared at the side of my face until I turned. "You're a lion in the field, but you tie yourself to a post for parasites, Diana. You pay them so they never have to ask who you really are." I pushed my bourbon away. The glass scraped across the wood. Joe's words hit the exact same place my dad's insults always landed, dead center of my chest. But the impact was different. Instead of pressing the wound closed the way I had trained myself to do, Joe's words cracked something open. I stared at the wet ring on the bar and recognized for the first time the full scope and shape of my own self-sabotage drawn in condensation on cheap wood grain. 6 years passed, 6 years of knowing the truth and still not acting on it. March 2022. My brother Logan had earned his promotion to captain. He called me from his base, his voice tight with nervous excitement, and begged me to attend the ceremony. It was his day, his accomplishment, his battlefield. I agreed because I would walk through fire for that kid. I had been walking through fire for him since the night I carried his screaming infant body across the attic floor at 3 in the morning. I approached the event the way I approached a forward operating base in hostile territory. Get in, support the target, draw zero fire, secure the perimeter around my brother, extract clean. I wore my Army service uniform, the dress blues. The jacket hung crisp on my shoulders, every crease pressed to regulation sharpness, every ribbon aligned. But I had a problem resting at the base of my throat. The pale blue ribbon of the Medal of Honor. 5-pointed star hanging from a silk moire. The single decoration in the entire United States Armed Forces that makes every uniformed person in a room stop mid-conversation and stare. I could not let my dad see it. His inferiority complex detonated like an anti-personnel mine whenever anyone in a room received attention that wasn't directed at him. One curious glance from an officer, one whispered, "Is that the Medal of Honor?" And the resulting tantrum would hijack Logan's ceremony, turning his proudest moment into the Walt Price victimhood hour. I had watched it happen before at Logan's officer candidate graduation. My dad had thrown a fit in the parking lot because the commandant spent 30 seconds longer shaking Logan's hand than shaking his. So I stood in front of the small mirror in the corridor outside the auditorium, my jaw set, my fingers working the top button of my dress blue collar. I pressed it toward the eyelet, trying to fasten it high enough to conceal the ribbon completely. My fingers, the same fingers that had clamped a general's severed artery shut on a mountain ridge that had threaded sutures in a moving helicopter, were trembling over a button. The button snapped off in my fingers. I stared at it resting in my palm. A small dark green disc, the thread still attached, curling like a tiny broken spring. I closed my fist around it. My jaw tightened. I looked in the mirror at the pale blue ribbon, now sitting fully exposed against the white collar of my shirt, and I understood that fate had filed its own opinion. I entered the auditorium at 9 a.m. sharp and executed a tactical scan. 200 officers in dress uniforms filled the rows. The air tasted like floor polish and burnt coffee from a side table. My dad stood near the front in a civilian blazer that cost more than a private's monthly paycheck, loudly lecturing a full-bird colonel about the superior Price genetics that had produced such a fine young officer. He gestured with a crystal glass of water as if he were addressing shareholders. Sabrina stood at his elbow in a cocktail dress, nodding after each of his sentences with the mechanical precision of a paid actress hitting her marks. Loretta sat in the second row, ankles crossed, surveying the room with the proprietary gaze of a woman who believed she had married into military royalty. I kept my head low, my chin tucked, and moved silently toward the front row. I reached the chair Logan had reserved for me. A small white name card sat propped against the seat back, SFC Price. I extended my hand to touch the armrest. A shadow crossed over me. I felt the air pressure shift the way it shifts right before a mortar round lands. My dad had locked onto my position from 12 feet away. He abandoned the colonel mid-sentence without apology and stormed down the aisle. His shoes hammered the polished floor. His jaw clenched in that familiar configuration, the single deep vertical crease between his eyebrows, the crease I had learned to read before I learned to read books. He reached for my name card. If you have ever shrunk yourself down to protect the fragile ego of a toxic family member, please hit the like button and share your story in the comments. You are not alone, and right now, we are about to watch a bully step on a landmine. My dad ripped the name card off the chair, crushed it in his fist, and delivered his venom 6 inches from my face. The words, the accusation, parasite, get the hell out, ruin. Every syllable calculated to strip me of my rank, my dignity, and my right to exist in the same room as him. I stood up, my spine locked straight. I gave him nothing, no tears, no trembling lip, no flinch, no satisfaction. Just a dead, flat stare. The same expression I wore when assessing casualties in a triage zone. He wanted a reaction. He wanted me to shrink. I gave him a wall of reinforced concrete. Then I turned for the doors. The auditorium held its breath. 200 officers, men and women who had served in Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, Somalia, had just watched a civilian publicly destroy his own daughter in a room full of combat veterans. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The silence was so total I could hear the air conditioning cycling through the overhead vents and the faint electrical hum of the fluorescent lights above the podium. Then a chair scraped, not from the front row, from the podium. Brigadier General Daniel Holt, 1 star on each shoulder, 30 years of combat deployments carved into the lines of his face, stepped off the elevated platform. He didn't walk to my brother. He didn't approach the microphone. He marched directly to me, his boots striking the polished floor in slow-measured, deliberate impacts that echoed off the auditorium walls like a drumbeat counting down to detonation. He stopped 3 feet from me. His right hand came up. It trembled not from age, not from weakness, but from the weight of 15 years of carrying a debt he had never been able to repay in person. The salute was textbook. Rigid. The angle, exact. His old eyes were wet, the moisture catching the overhead light. I've waited 15 years to do this in person, Sergeant. The room detonated. 200 officers launched to their feet. The thunder of chairs scraping backward and boots hitting the floor in unison shook the walls. Every man and woman in that auditorium snapped to attention and held their salute. The sound was massive, a single unified crack of human respect that hit my chest like a concussion wave. 200 bodies standing rigid, 200 arms locked at the brow, 200 pairs of eyes aimed at me. My dad turned to stone. The smug patrician mask drained of every drop of blood. His jaw went slack. His hand still holding the crushed name card dropped to his sides. His facial muscles twitched in rapid, uncontrollable spasms as his brain, a brain wired exclusively for social dominance and image management, scrambled to process data that did not fit inside any framework he possessed. The woman he had just publicly branded a parasite, his own daughter. The ghost from the attic. The failure, the clerk. The pollution was receiving the supreme military honor protocol from the highest-ranking officer in the room. A 1-star general was saluting her. And behind that general, 200 commissioned officers stood at rigid attention, their arms locked in identical salutes, their boots planted on the floor like a formation carved from stone. Every rigid body was a vote, and every single vote was against him. Loretta's smirk had evaporated. She sat in the second row with her hands clenched in her lap, her face the color of curdled milk. Sabrina stared at the scene with her mouth slightly open, the cocktail dress suddenly looking less like fashion and more like a costume worn to the wrong event. General Holt held the salute for a long 5 seconds. Then he lowered his hand, took 1 step closer, and dropped his voice to a pitch meant only for me and the ashen civilian statue standing behind me. Your father needs to understand something about who you are. Say the word sergeant, and I will make it surgically clear. I returned the salute. My arm was rigid. My breathing controlled 3 tactical breaths in through the nose, out through the mouth, the same rhythm I used when my hands were inside a wounded soldier's chest cavity. My heartbeat was 62 beats per minute. I knew because I was counting. Please finish my brother's promotion, sir. Today is his battlefield. Holt nodded once. He held my gaze for a long beat, searching my face for any sign of wavering. He found granite. Then he turned his head and threw a look of absolute, undiluted disgust at my father. A look that carried the full weight of a one-star general's authority and a combat veteran's contempt for cowardice. My dad flinched like he'd been slapped. General Holt walked back to the podium. The 200 officers remained standing, their salutes held until I lowered myself into the front row chair. After the ceremony, General Holt pulled me aside in the corridor. His jaw was clamped, his fists balled tight at his sides. The fury radiating off his body was physical. I could feel it like standing next to an open furnace. That man is living inside a fantasy. Holt said, his voice low and controlled. I will drive to his house tonight and demolish every lie he has ever told about you. He needs to hear what you did on that ridge. He needs to hear it from the man whose blood was on your hands. I shook my head. I secured my cover under my arm. I met his eyes the way I had met them on that mountain ridge 11 years earlier, steady, certain, and finished negotiating. This room knows the only part that matters, sir. I walked out to my truck in the parking lot, my boots crunching gravel. Behind me, through the auditorium doors, I could hear the low murmur of 200 officers exchanging whispers. My father was drowning in that sound, and I left him there. The drive back to base took 4 hours. I drove in complete silence, no radio, no phone, no music. Just the hum of tires on asphalt, the yellow center line scrolling endlessly beneath my headlights, and the darkness pressing against the windows of the cab like deep water. Joe Pratt's voice played on a loop inside my skull. You pay them so they never have to ask who you really are. He had said it 6 years ago in that bar, his fist still resting on the counter next to my untouched bourbon. I had nodded. I had pushed the glass away. And I had done absolutely nothing. I kept writing the checks, kept covering the mortgage payment on a house where my mother's photograph was stored in a garage behind a lawnmower, kept feeding the Mercedes and the country club dues and the electricity bill that lit the rooms I wasn't welcome in. I wasn't keeping the peace. I was financing the enemy. Every dollar I sent home was a bullet loaded into a gun pointed at my own head. My dad didn't use that money to build a life, he used it to build a stage, and on that stage, he performed the role of a wealthy patriarch while I played the designated failure in the back row. A commanding officer never funds hostile forces. That was Rule 1 burned into every strategic doctrine I had ever studied, and I had been violating it since the day I cashed my first deployment paycheck at 18 years old. I didn't cry out of anger. I let a few tears fall for the 10-year-old girl in the attic, the one who had paced the creaking floorboards at 3 a.m. with a baby pressed against her chest, believing with every step that if she just gave enough of herself, someone downstairs would eventually look up. That girl deserved to grieve. I gave her 3 miles of dark highway. Then I wiped my face with the back of my hand and pulled into the base parking lot. The next morning I sat at my metal desk in the barracks at 6 a.m. The room smelled like black coffee and gun oil. Pale light came through the single window. I pulled out a clean sheet of paper, uncapped a black pen, and wrote a letter to Walt Price. No profanity, no accusations, no emotional appeals. Just the freezing decree of a military judge reading a verdict to a man who had already been found guilty. I've spent 30 years pumping money to keep your delusion of greatness alive just to be trampled under your boots. From this moment on, I stopped funding that paranoia. Any contact not rooted in genuine remorse will be rejected. I set the pen down, read the letter once, folded it with a single clean crease. Then I took a copy of my Medal of Honor citation, the official document, the one with the Department of Defense seal, and the President's signature, and slid it into the envelope. I uncapped a yellow highlighter and dragged it across the specific paragraph that described the mountain ridge in 2011. The bloody details, the machine gun fire, the 3 sprints, the severed artery, the bullet in my leg. I wanted him to read every word, and I wanted those words to glow. I added one final line at the bottom of the page, written in my own hand. Be curious about who I am before you decide who I am. I sealed the envelope, set it aside for mailing, and opened my laptop. The banking portal loaded. The screen glowed pale blue in the dim barracks room. I placed my cursor on the first account linked to the Price family. Then I executed a flawless tactical retreat. Click 1. I canceled all secondary credit cards attached to my account. The ones Loretta used for groceries. The one Sabrina used for her salon appointments and online shopping. The one my dad used for his country club membership and restaurant tabs. Every card. Dead. Click 2. I terminated the auto pay authorization for the Price family mortgage and the Mercedes-Benz monthly lease. Both had been drafting from my checking account for over a decade. Both were now orphaned. Click 3. I blocked the insurance premium drafts homeowner's auto and the supplemental health plan I'd quietly maintained for a man who publicly denied my existence at dinner parties. 30 years of financial blood supply severed permanently in 3 mechanical clicks. The cursor blinked on the confirmation screen. I stared at it for 10 seconds. Then I closed the laptop lid, pressing it down slowly until it latched shut with a soft, final click. The vault was locked. Forever. When you pull the primary support pillar from a rotting castle, you don't need a wrecking ball. Gravity does the rest. I learned the details later in fragments through Logan's phone calls, Sabrina's panicked voicemails to relatives that got forwarded back to me, and the bank's automated notifications hitting my email. Within 7 days, the decline notices hammered the Price house like artillery rounds landing in sequence. The visa was rejected at the grocery store checkout on day 2. Loretta stood at the register with a cart full of organic produce and imported cheese, her face flushing from pink to crimson while the cashier swiped the card a 3rd time. Shook her head and asked if she had another form of payment. Loretta swiped a 2nd card. Declined. A 3rd. Declined. She abandoned the cart and walked out of the store with nothing her heels, clicking double time across the parking lot. Day 3. The MasterCard flatlined at Sabrina's hair salon, mid-highlight aluminum foils, still clipped to her scalp, the stylist standing behind her with a comb in one hand and an expression of professional discomfort on her face. Sabrina had to call Loretta to bring cash. Loretta didn't have any. Day 5. The mortgage company mailed a certified letter with a red, "Final Notice" stamp. My dad held it in the kitchen, reading the same paragraph 3 times while Loretta stood behind him, asking what it meant, and he didn't answer because he didn't know he had never seen a delinquency notice in his life, because I had been intercepting them for over a decade. Day 7. A recovery agent in a wrinkled polo shirt and khaki pants showed up in the driveway, clipboard in hand, to photograph the Mercedes and affix a yellow sticker to the driver's side window. My dad watched from the living room window, gripping the curtain with both hands. The upper-class illusion, 3 decades in the making, funded entirely by a daughter they called a parasite, was stripped bare like old wallpaper, exposing the hollow, water-damaged rot underneath. Every lamp, every appliance, every square foot of heated floor space in that house had run on my blood and my money. And now the power was off. My dad's response was the only response a narcissist knows. He didn't look inward. He didn't self-examine. He didn't call me and ask what he had done wrong. He attacked. My phone vibrated across my desk at 2 p.m. I checked the caller ID. I pressed the speaker button. I leaned back in my chair, laced my fingers behind my head, and stared at the water stain on the ceiling tile directly above me. Walt Price was unraveling. His voice came through the tinny desk speaker, in a frantic, threatening roar, cracking on the high notes, stuttering on the consonants, the words smashing into each other like a man sprinting downhill and losing control of his own legs. What kind of ungrateful garbage are you pulling? Trying to destroy this family. You owe me your life. I let the echo die. I didn't sit up. I didn't raise my voice. I kept my eyes fixed on the water stain. My tone came out flat-measured and as emotionally dead as the concrete foundation beneath the building. I paid off that life with dollars for 30 years. Goodbye. I reached forward and pressed the red button. The speaker went silent. I opened my contacts list, scrolled to his name, and blocked the number. Then I placed the phone face down on the desk and picked up my pen. I had a requisition form to complete. The panic spread through the Price house like a gas leak, searching for a spark. Sabrina, the same woman who had spread the Photoshop lie, who had spent 6 years telling the extended family that my White House photos were fabricated, who had never held a job longer than 4 months or paid a bill with her own money, launched a desperate counterattack. She sat on her bed with her phone mascara streaking down her face and called every relative in the family tree. Aunts, uncles, second cousins she hadn't spoken to since high school. She sobbed into the phone with the practiced skill of a woman who had never in her manicured life been told the word no and expected it to stick. She played the victim with the same surgical precision she had once used to spread lies about me. Diana is committing financial abuse against an elderly man, she wailed to anyone who would answer. She's trying to destroy Daddy's retirement out of jealousy because she's always been jealous of our family. But Sabrina made a critical tactical error. She didn't know about the ceremony. She didn't know that half the family's extended network had already heard through the military grapevine, through whispered phone calls, through officers who talked to veterans, who talked to civilians, who sat in the same church pews as my aunts and uncles, exactly what had happened at Logan's promotion. She walked straight into a trap she didn't know existed. My Uncle Ray, the same man who had politely sipped his wine while my dad called me a clerk at Thanksgiving, picked up Sabrina's call. He listened for 12 seconds. Then he cut her off mid-sob. "Shut up! I saw a general stand at attention for her with my own eyes. This whole house is blind." He hung up. The line went dead. Sabrina stared at her phone. Within 48 hours, 5 other relatives called back. Not to offer support, to withdraw it. My Aunt Helen, the same woman who had forwarded Sabrina's Photoshop text, with a laughing emoji in 2016, left a voicemail so sharp it could have drawn blood. My cousin Marcus told Loretta he was ashamed to share a last name with them. The invitations to holiday dinners stopped arriving. The Christmas card list contracted. The carefully curated social circle my dad had spent 30 years constructing, oiled with my money, decorated with my silence, collapsed inward like a burnt building, losing its frame. The boycott of Walt Price had begun, and nobody was coming to put the fire out. General Holt was not a man who forgot debts. He operated on a code as rigid as the steel plate in a Humvee door. You save my life, I carry that weight until I die. So when rumors of my dad's smear campaign trickled through the military grapevine, officers who had witnessed the ceremony talking to retired veterans in Walt's social orbit, Holt absorbed the intelligence with the cold patience of a man planning a counteroffensive. Then he moved. Holt told me afterward what happened. Every detail? He wanted me to know. He drove his personal vehicle, a black Tahoe, straight into my dad's upscale neighborhood on a Tuesday afternoon. He wore civilian clothes, pressed khakis, a polo shirt, and a windbreaker that did nothing to disguise the military bearing welded into his posture. He walked up the flagstone path past the hedges my deployment checks had kept manicured for 15 years and knocked on the front door 3 times. My dad opened the door expecting a neighbor or a salesman. He found a 1-star general standing on his welcome mat with the expression of a man about to deliver a court-martial verdict. Holt didn't ask to come in. He walked through the door, scanned the living room in a single sweep, and sat down on the expensive leather sofa. Loretta appeared in the kitchen doorway, clutching a dish towel, her eyes wide. Sabrina froze halfway down the staircase, one hand gripping the banister. My dad lowered himself into the armchair opposite Holt, his face cycling through confusion, annoyance, and the first cracks of genuine fear. "Sit down and listen," Holt said. His voice was calm in the way that a cocked hammer is calm still loaded, and one trigger pull from destruction. "You are going to hear the truth about your daughter, and you are going to sit there until I am finished." My dad opened his mouth to protest. Holt raised one finger, just one. My dad's mouth closed. With the gritty, unhurried cadence of a soldier who had carried body bags off helicopters and stood at gravesides in the rain, General Holt described the mountain ridge in 2011. He described the ambush, the eruption of machine gun fire from 3 elevated positions, the RPG that turned the lead vehicle into a column of black smoke, 6 soldiers pinned in a kill zone with no cover and no medic within 1,000 meters. Except one. He described me. He described how I sprinted through machine gun fire 3 separate times across open ground with 0 suppressive cover, dragging wounded men behind rock formations, while rounds kicked up dirt 6 inches from my boots. He described my blood-soaked hands clamping his severed femoral artery shut, my fingers, slippery with his blood, my grip absolute, refusing to do math with death, while a second burst of automatic fire tore through the rocks above our heads. He described the bullet that punched through my left calf mid-sprint and how I didn't stop, didn't look down, didn't cry out. I kept working on his artery with my hands and talked him through the shock with my voice until the medevac arrived 14 minutes later. My dad's face had gone the color of wet ash. He gripped both armrests, his knuckles white, his chest barely moving. He opened his mouth. The words came out thin and scrambling, the desperate tone of a man grasping for the last handhold on a collapsing cliff. "You've got the wrong person. She's just a failure of a woman." Holt's heavy fist slammed into the glass coffee table. The impact cracked through the room like a gunshot. The crystal candy dish jumped and clinked. Loretta pressed her back flat against the kitchen door frame. Sabrina's hand tightened on the banister until her fingernails went white. Holt leaned forward until his face was 6 inches from my father's. He delivered every word like a round from a rifle at close range. The only failure in this room is you. Walt, you threw a diamond in the trash because you were blinded by vanity. Your daughter is a national hero. And you're just a coward in a suit. My dad collapsed into the armchair. Not a controlled sit, a collapse. His body folded like a structure losing its load-bearing wall. The arrogance didn't drain from his face. It shattered like a porcelain mask dropped on a tile floor. What remained underneath was hollow. Empty. Pathetic. A small deflated man sitting in an expensive living room he could no longer afford. Surrounded by leather furniture someone else had paid for, wearing a watch, funded by the daughter he had called pollution for 30 years. Loretta stood in the kitchen doorway with both hands pressed over her mouth. Sabrina had retreated halfway up the staircase and sat down on a step, gripping her own knees, staring at the carpet. Holt stood up. He buttoned his windbreaker, looked down at the broken man in the armchair one more time, and walked out the front door without another word. He left the truth sitting in the middle of the living room like a grenade with the pin pulled. It would keep detonating for weeks. The truth spared no one. 2 days after Holt's visit, Logan appeared at my barracks. I heard his boots in the corridor, slow, uncertain steps. Nothing like the confident stride of a newly promoted captain. He stopped in my doorway. His eyes were swollen and red. In his trembling hands, he held the stack of financial documents I had forwarded to him: bank statements, wire transfer receipts, mortgage payment records, tuition invoices. 30 years of evidence printed in columns and decimal points. Why did you pay my tuition fee that house and let them treat you like dirt? His voice broke on the last word. I crossed the room and pulled him into a hug. He was taller than me, broader, built like the officer he had earned the right to be. But in that doorway, he was the crying infant I had carried across the attic floor at 3 a.m., and I was the ghost who had never stopped protecting him. The truth was out. It hung between us, heavier than any rucksack I had ever humped up a mountain. I answered him. Standing in that barracks doorway with my brother's tears soaking into my t-shirt shoulder, I gave him the only honest answer I had. Because I used to think love had to be bought, but I learned to stop paying for fakes. Logan held on for another minute. Then he stepped back, wiped his face with his sleeve, and straightened his spine the way a soldier does when he has absorbed a blow and decided what to do next. He made phone calls. He set a date. He organized a family dinner at the Price House and informed every member of the family that attendance was mandatory, and the evening's agenda was not open for discussion. 1 month later, I walked through the front door of the house I'd funded for 3 decades. I wore civilian clothes, jeans, worn leather boots, and a plain canvas jacket. No dress uniform, no medals pinned to my chest, no rank insignia on my collar. I didn't need the armor. My presence alone carried the full weight of every detonated truth. My dad waited by the front door. He looked 10 years older than the man who had ripped my name card at the ceremony. His spine was curved forward, his shoulders pulled inward, his entire body compressing under a weight that no doctor could diagnose and no chiropractor could straighten. His hands shook violently as he reached out to take my jacket, a gesture so foreign and so desperate that it looked like a man performing a ritual he had learned from a manual 5 minutes earlier. He mumbled something, a broken cluster of syllables that might have been an apology if it contained any courage or structure. I nodded once and walked past him. He had forfeited the right to call himself my father somewhere between the hospital corridor and the attic staircase. He was a defeated acquaintance, a stranger holding a jacket. I stopped in the center of the living room. There, hanging dead center on the main wall, the exact spot where Loretta had removed it 21 years ago. The nail hole, still visible beneath the new frame, was the photograph of my mother. Her sad brown eyes, her stubborn jaw, the same face I saw in my own mirror every morning. And framed directly beside it, mounted with military precision and a level's accuracy, was the copy of my Medal of Honor citation. Every documented detail of the mountain ridge printed in official government typeface, bearing the Department of Defense seal and the president's signature. I stood there and looked at my mother's face for a long time. 21 years she had spent face down in a box behind a lawnmower, erased by a woman with Louis Vuitton luggage and a 13-year-old prop. Now she was back on the wall, back in the light, back in the center of the house she had built before the cancer took her from me in that bleach-white hospital corridor. The photograph was slightly faded, the colors muted by 2 decades of garage darkness, but her eyes were exactly as I remembered them. Sad, stubborn, mine. The house had been physically redecorated by the blunt force of truth. Nobody in this room had put those frames on that wall out of love or regret. They put them there because reality had left them no other option. The dining room smelled like roasted chicken and fresh bread Loretta had cooked for the first time in years. Not because she wanted to, but because she could no longer afford the caterer she had been hiring with my credit card. The table was set with the good china, the kind they only brought out for company. I was company now. That fact settled over the room like a change in altitude. Logan stood at the head of the table. The room was dead silent. Loretta sat rigid in her chair, both hands flat on the tablecloth, her manicured nails pressing into the linen, staring at her plate as if it contained instructions for survival. Sabrina studied her own lap with the focused concentration of a woman trying to will herself invisible, the same skill I had perfected in this house at age 10, now turned back on the person who had stolen my bedroom and my father's attention without a second thought. My dad shuffled to a chair at the far end and began nervously arranging the silverware at my place setting, straightening the fork, adjusting the knife, repositioning the water glass, folding and refolding the napkin with trembling fingers. He moved with the frantic servile precision of a hired waiter on his first night, desperate to avoid being fired by the only person in the room whose opinion mattered. Nobody made small talk. Nobody asked how I was doing. The polished social machinery that had powered this family's public image for 30 years had seized and locked. Without my money lubricating the gears, there was nothing left to perform. Logan raised his glass. The room froze. To my sister, a true hero whom from now on no one in this family is allowed to disrespect. Dead silence. The words hung above the table like a verdict etched into the air. Nobody clinked glasses, nobody objected, nobody breathed. The only sound was the quiet clink of my dad's fork against the plate rim as his shaking hand knocked it sideways. I smiled. Not a warm smile, not forgiveness, not the relieved grin of a woman who had been welcomed home. It was the controlled, quiet expression of a soldier standing on ground she had bled for and finally claimed. I looked at my mother's photograph on the wall. Her sad brown eyes stared back at me from across 30 years of silence, and for the first time, I didn't feel the ache. I felt the steel she had left inside me, the stubborn jaw, the refusal to break, the ability to stand upright in a house designed to crush me. I picked up my glass of water. Not wine, water. I raised it toward Logan, toward my mother's photograph, toward the life I had built with my own scarred hands. And I took a long, slow drink. The war was over. I didn't burn their house down. I just cut the power and let the dark consume them. Forgiveness doesn't mean you have to keep paying for someone else's toxic illusions. If Diana's story gave you the strength to cut off your own emotional leeches, hit like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments how you finally took your power back.